Okay, gang. I have become completely undependable in getting out readable notes. Evidently, Caroline said they were in a format that she couldn't open, so I guess that was true for everyone. So um, I apologize for that. I sent them out when Caroline called me and said that they were in the wrong format. I sent them out again, so you've probably got them in your inbox.
I just got it.
I read them, yep.
But I will probably touch on most of the points that were covered in those brief notes. And since tonight is our last night, at least for the summer probably, maybe I sort of recap a little bit of the last 2 or 3 weeks. Week before last, we talked about the 6 epistles of Paul, the Apostle Paul, that are attributed to him. And then last week, we picked up the balance of the epistles that are attributed to authors other than Paul, but carry essentially the same message. And that message is that Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. And so when he went out after the crucifixion of Jesus, he went into outlying areas and tried to convert Gentiles to Christianity. And those letters, subsequent letters that he followed up with, were letters that are going to be pretty much like the letters we'll talk about tonight from Peter and the book of Hebrews and the book of James. And those are letters of exhortation. In other words, they are to bolster up the established group of Christians that they have converted in these various areas, to reinforce their morale and to answer questions that may be arising, to tell them to bear up under oppression and the criticism that they're getting, and sometimes actual harm that's coming to some of them. So those are the purpose of these letters, and to reassure them of the coming of Christ, because that is, as we have seen in the Paul's letters, that becomes an issue. The longer time goes along, it becomes an issue that these people are starting to worry about that, and they're starting to become concerned about that. So tonight we'll talk about some letters that are particularly from the Jewish standpoint. These are not letters to Gentile Christians. These are letters and epistles to Jewish Christians, people that were Jews, that were loyal to the Jewish Torah, but were converted to Christ. And so they have their own problems. And so they were led primarily by James, John, and Peter. And Peter and James were the 2 mainstays that stayed in and around Jerusalem after the time of Christ. And Peter was the more evangelical of the 2. James was the more authority figure of the 2, the one that sort of inherited the church overall. He was the one that made the major decisions, but Peter was much more active, and he was out into Judea and even to other countries, evangelizing and converting people to Christianity. So we get back to this question that we've discussed nearly every week that we've met, and that is, who wrote these books that we talk about? And we have said over and over again that it is not known who wrote these books, but there are reasons to think that one way or another many times. First and Second Peter, that we'll talk about briefly, the author claims to be Peter as it opens up, but that, as we said last week, that doesn't necessarily mean very much. If any author that was trying to write a pseudonymous book and claim, he would probably claim that he was Peter in order to give it more authority and so forth. But on the other hand, it's the same with James, when we talk about a little bit later. if someone writes a book and a name of someone else, that in itself speaks well of that person that they're writing the book in their name, because it shows that they think that that is someone that people would read and pay attention to. And in any event, whoever wrote these books, in any event, they carried the message that the author would have thought that that person would have wanted them to say. So that's the important part. They are not taking issue with that, what that person thought or would have thought about and would have written about. They are trying to reinforce that. So whether it was Peter or someone later, it really doesn't matter. It's Peter's message. It's either from his own pen or from someone that was writing in his place. One of the reasons that the First and Second Peter seems a little bit later is that in First and Second Peter, he refers to Paul, and he refers to Paul's writings, and he even refers to them as scripture. So and they both died at about the same time. Paul and Peter both were put to death in Rome somewhere around in the 60 to 65 CE. So if it were Peter, it would be difficult for him to already have known about Paul's letters and known that they had become sort of accepted as authentic and scriptural. But so most scholars, I would say, think that these First and Second Peter was written around 80 or 90, somewhere in that area, but certainly written with the message that would have been the message of Peter. And they start out, I think, I'll try to cover any points that I had in those brief notes that since I didn't get them out successfully, I'll sort of jump back and forth between my notes. But Peter starts out and he's writing a letter that's sort of a circular letter, and it's a letter that's going out. It's sort of like some of Paul's more later pseudonymous letters, where they would send it. It was sort of like a form letter. It would go to a church, but he would also say, and give this same letter to the church that's 8 miles away or 15 miles away, and so forth. So these letters, the First and Second Peter, are letters that were sent out sort of like a circular letter to certain provinces: Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. That's in First Peter. He says that's who these letters are going to, and they are letters that are encouraging these people to hold the faith and to keep their faith, and that he wants to address any issues that they may be having that are causing them to fall away, and particularly any issues that they may have having to do with their being harassed, or that they're being persecuted in any way. And here again, these letters carry the overtone, both Paul's letters and these letters from Peter. They carry the overtone of hold on to things just the way they are, because there is a new world coming. There's going to be a second coming. It's not going to be that long. So don't just hang on, because that's the essence of what these people have been converted with the thought in mind that this is a new Christianity that is going to duplicate Christ's own resurrection by the fact that we will also be resurrected. But the problem is that the longer it goes without happening, the more troubled they become and the more concerned they become. So that I mentioned that again because that is also the reason that we hear in these epistles, both from Paul and these from Peter, that such things as slaves obey your master, and such things that even in some of Paul's letters, he is encouraging that if you aren't married, don't bother to get married, because you just really wouldn't have time, because these things are so imminent don't change much about your life, you know. So slaves submit to your masters. In Peter, he says, not only to those who are good and considerate, but also to those who are harsh. It is commendable to bear up under the pain of unjust suffering because they are conscious of God. So there's another theme too, and that is the theme of that is somehow holy to bear up under suffering. In other words, put up with the suffering that you're encountering because this will all be overcome. In other words, there's a second coming that's going to take place that will make all the suffering that you're experiencing worthwhile. So those are the themes that run through 1st and 2nd Peter, and it addresses the persecution of Christians, encourages them to keep the faith, and here again, the persecution that he keeps addressing in 1st and 2nd Peter is uncertain as to what exact persecution that he's talking about, but it's probably persecution by the Romans, because in 81 CE, Domitian became the ruler of Rome, and he declared himself as a divine figure. So that led to a lot of oppression of Christians during that time. So in 2nd Peter, Peter goes on to make reference to his. I use the word Peter as to whether it was Peter or not. That he makes reference to his approaching death. He says, "Since I know that the putting off of my body will be soon, as our Lord Jesus Christ has made clear to me." So that, however, could be something there again that someone who was writing in Peter's name would have thought would have been appropriate to put in there. And Peter takes an unusual tack to explain why Christ has not come yet. You remember the reasons that were given in Paul. Paul was telling them that that certain things had to be fulfilled. Remember that there was going to be an Antichrist that would come, and that the Antichrist would appear on earth, and that there were other scriptural things that from the Old Testament that would need to happen before the second coming of Christ. Peter gives them a new reason that he justifies why they should be content to wait, and that he explains that the delay in Jesus' return is to facilitate the salvation of those who are already faithful, but may have wavered in their faith or been led astray. In other words, Peter is saying God wants as many people as possible to be caught up in this wonderful rapture that's going to take place at the end of time. And he is waiting and delaying, but because more and more, in order for more and more people to become part of that group. And Peter's saying that people have been falling astray. They've been no longer being followers, and that God is waiting for that to change and turn around, and he's encouraging him to do that. So he encourages followers to await the consummation of his kingdom with attention, service, and perseverance, and live a life that is pleasing to God, and to hold firmly to the truth. So that's generally what 1st and 2nd Peter is about. It's an exhortation to keep the faith and to hold on. And one of the things about all these letters, whether it's Paul's or these letters from Peter, is that it's more about the fact that you're not really going to have a great life here on earth, because you are going to be persecuted, you're going to have sickness, you're going to have setbacks and all, but it's all going to be worthwhile if you can just hold on to the next world. And so that's the lesson. So I want to move on now to and talk about Hebrews. Hebrews is a book that there's no need even talking about the author of Hebrews, because nobody really has advanced any name that has stuck. It was important in the early time when the canon was being formed that they try to figure out who wrote this book of Hebrews, but no one could ever make a case for anyone that everybody else would go along with. So it almost did not get in the canon, because authorship was very, very important to books getting in the New Testament canon. And you had to know who wrote it. And that's why a lot of books were assigned to Paul, and those books got in the canon. Later on, scholars have figured out, well, probably not Paul, but some follower of Paul, but they're still in the canon. But Hebrews, not so. It's just unknown who wrote the book. It's one of the best books in the Bible from a standpoint of its literary quality. It says, scholars consider this letter to be the most polished and eloquent work in the whole New Testament. And so it is certainly not Paul's spontaneous, volatile, and very personal Greek writing. It seems to be written for Jewish Christians who lived in and around Jerusalem. It attempts to exhort Christians to persevere in the face of persecution and to resist the temptation to renounce Christianity or to turn back to pure Judaism and adherence to the traditional Jewish law. So there's a lot in Hebrews. It's all to Jews, and it's explaining to Jews the difference between a life believing in Christ and still being Jewish, and a life that you live your life under the Torah. And you remember how I told you that one of the trends that we observe as we go through all this is the trend toward anti-Judaism, further and further getting away from adherence to the Torah and its teachings. In Paul started it all by raising the question as to whether or not Gentiles would be required to observe the Torah and the food and dietary laws of the Torah, as well as the laws about circumcision, things like that. So, but Paul never really took issue with the Torah so much, except only for the people that he was converting. He was saying this group right here, that these are Gentiles. They're not Jewish people. These are Gentiles. So they have come to Christ and they have become Christians. They shouldn't have to go back and adhere to Jewish laws and Jewish rules. So that was as far as it went with Paul. But but with the advent of Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, it goes full tilt now that not only do Jewish Christians not have to adhere to the Torah, but the Torah has been superseded. It's no longer even valid for Jews, for anyone, that the Torah is obsolete. And I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about that, because I think it's sort of important, the rationale that is in Hebrews, because I think it's the most important thing in Hebrews. Some of us have been to church and we've heard our pastor refer to the new covenant. And he's saying, the new covenant. Well, what does that mean? What exactly is the new covenant? And so all of that is what is covered in detail in the book of Hebrews. So I made some notes here. In the Old Testament, there are several covenants that over time are enumerated in the Old Testament, covenants that God made with Israel, with his people, Israel. The first one is called Noahic covenant, which is early on in Genesis. when God said, I establish my covenant with you that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. Remember that, that's a covenant that God made, and we've all heard that God promised in the Bible that there would never be another flood that would destroy the earth. So that's that covenant. Then there's the Abrahamic covenant, which is also in Genesis, and it's the one that God is saying, get out of your country, form your family, and from your father's house, go to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great. I will bless those who will bless you and curse him who curses you. And in you, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So you remember that covenant that God has made with blessing the Abraham and his descendants and sent them to this new land. But the covenant that Hebrews is going to deal with is called the Mosaic covenant, and that is the covenant that God makes with the people when Moses comes down from Mount Sinai. So this is the promise that God makes to Israel that is dependent on people's response to the law that he gives through his servant Moses. In other words, there are components to the law of the Mosaic law, one being the 10 commandments that Moses gave, the 10 commandments, and the second being the laws that are contained in the Torah, in the first, 5 books of the Old Testament. All of those laws which we've been talking about, which are the food laws, the various laws pertaining to circumcision, laws pertaining to how to treat illnesses, laws pertaining to the Sabbath, all those laws are under the Mosaic covenant. Now, in the book of Hebrews, it makes the case that the Mosaic covenant is no longer valid, that it has been superseded, that it is no longer a valid covenant. And there is some scripture that is in the book of Jeremiah that speaks to the day is coming when there is a new covenant. I thought I made a note of that somewhere. Maybe it's in my let's see. I put a note in the other notes that the term for that is supersessionism. This view holds that there is a new covenant through Jesus Christ that has superseded or replaced the Mosaic covenant. Further, the Christian church has succeeded the ancient Israelites as the people of God. See, it's going even another step. Roman Catholic, Methodist, as well as Reformed churches hold that the old covenant had 3 components: the ceremonial, a moral, and a civil judicial component. Only the moral law of the 10 commandments has not been abolished in the new covenant and still binds Christian believers. That's sort of an odd thing that in this Mosaic covenant, the element of it that has to do with the 10 commandments has not been tossed out, but the other parts have been tossed out. The food laws and all of the other admonitions of the Torah. And you know, the many of them that are in Leviticus and so forth. And so a question arose to me today in thinking about this. We can, when we're talking in a minute about James, we can go back to this, but in Hebrews, the claim is being made that there is a new covenant now that replaces the Mosaic covenant, that God's covenant with the people through the 10 commandments and through the laws of the Torah. And so I was wondering what Jesus, how he, in his life and ministry, reacted towards the Torah and toward the covenant, the Mosaic covenant. And so I poked around a little bit today, and I found that was mixed. It seemed like in many instances I could find that Jesus supported the law, and I think there's a scriptural verse some of y'all may remember, but I think Jesus is quoted in one of the Gospels as saying, "I did not come to abolish the law, but to uphold it." So, but yet, and so we know that I think in one of our earlier sessions we were talking about Jesus curing the person that was a leper, and he told them not to tell anybody, but he said, "Go back to your priest and have him perform the rites that they did for lepers." So there's something in the Old Testament, in the Torah, about the religious procedure that you go through for people that have leprosy. And so Jesus was admonishing him to do that. Go ahead and do that, even though I have cured you. And then I found something that's on the contrary of that, is that you remember how Jesus on at least 2 occasions took issue with people who wanted to observe the Sabbath, because he felt that he had something at hand that was more important than a mere observance of something. In other words, if you have an opportunity to feed a hungry person that's in need, that trumps trying to adhere to some law or something. So that I seem to have that feeling in there about Jesus. So that's why I'm saying it may be a little bit up in the air as to how Jesus felt about it, but certainly in Hebrews makes no bones about it that this law that Paul kept talking about, that he was trying to get permission from James and Peter not to have Gentiles adhere to, that now it's been absolved. It's no longer any good. In Hebrews chapter 8, the justification for doing away with the Mosaic covenant, it says, but as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is enacted on better promises. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second one. And it goes on to say, and speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. This is chapter 8, verse 13. This is scriptural I'm reading. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So you see how far we've come now, all the way up into the book of Hebrews, where this question of whether it's required to have circumcision, whether the food laws are still in effect, and all that Hebrews is putting an end to all that. So that's the main thing that I wanted to cover in the book of Hebrews. It goes on in Hebrews to make the case that Jesus is not on a par with people like Abraham and all that. The people that the Jews have looked up to so much, it sort of uses Abraham over and over in Hebrews as like a whipping boy. It shows Jesus' superiority time and time again to Abraham, so I put a note here. Hebrews takes us further away from the apocalyptic divinity empowered human leader who would bring the kingdom of God to earth and rule here on earth, abolishing rulers who oppose and rule the people harshly. Jesus' superiority is emphasized compared to Moses and to angels. And another contrast that the author of Hebrews uses to Jesus says he keeps he keeps emphasizing the pre-existence of Jesus. He's existed before he existed. And he doesn't, and he says, you don't make that claim for Abraham, you don't make that claim for Moses. So that's Hebrews for you. I did have an interesting note that about the possible author of Hebrews, and some pretty well-known scholars have opted for Priscilla. Do you remember the name Priscilla, who was a teacher that Paul is mentioned in Acts, that had helped organize some of the churches for Paul, and she was a Gentile that had married a Jew, and evidently a person of some notable talent and in organizing these early churches. And Alfred von Harnack is a famous German theologian that he wrote a book on claiming that Priscilla wrote the book of Hebrews and giving his reasons and all why he thought so. And one of the reasons was that seemed to have a little bit of credibility is that the earliest copies that are available of the book of Hebrews, the author is blacked out, is marked out and been scratched through, so you can't read it. So he's saying, why would they do that? Well, they did it because it was a woman. That was his thinking, and that why else? Who else would have been in there that they would not have wanted to know it? So that's just a little interesting side bit there about who possibly wrote Hebrews. But anytime you go to a class that someone's teaching a Sunday school class and someone's teaching Hebrews, that'll be a big subject of discussion as to who may have been the author, because it is written in a way that you're saying, gosh, this was a writer that wrote this. There's somebody that really knew the Greek language and knew how to put things into phrases properly and so forth. Now, any comments or questions before we move on to James?
Dad, I had just one thing back to the letters that we were talking about, 1st and 2nd Peter.
Yes.
You remember when we talked about Paul, you pointed out there was, I don't know, almost the familiar nature where Paul would say, Betsy and Susie, you all get along. And when we look at the letters from Peter, are we further away? It's not that kind of personal admonitions to each church?
That's right. In other words, it's like a circular letter that would be sent to 8 or 9 churches, and it's generic. It doesn't apply to any one of them any more than another. It's like it's just, this is a letter, and this carried on. These particular ones got into the New Testament, but this circular letter type communication carried on for hundreds of years. You remember I mentioned that the letter that was put out like this to all of the churches and bishops that contained said these 27 books are the canon for the New Testament. The first time that ever happened in 392 CE, 392 years, 360 years after the time of Christ, they finally got around to deciding what the New Testament looked like and what 27 books should be in it. And that was disseminated in a letter like this. It went around to all the churches. Anything else? Any other comment? James is another book. It's next to Mark is my favorite book in the New Testament by far. It's a book that I really enjoy reading, and I enjoy having other people talk about. And we have at our church, Palm City Presbyterian, one real wonderful gentleman who was a Presbyterian pastor himself, but he is now retired, been retired maybe 10 years, and he lives over in the Presbyterian village in St. Pete, but he comes all the way over here to go to our church. And he's a great person, and he's a great teacher, just a gentle, kind person all the way around. and he's going to teach a Sunday school class on the book of James coming up here soon at our church. And if I can possibly sneak under the COVID rules, I'm going to try to go in there and listen to that, because every time I've ever taught the class, he's always been out there, and he makes me feel so good, because he'll set up his little phone and make a recording of my class and all, as if it was something important. And so it's very, very flattering for him to do that. But he will do a great job on teaching the book of James. And I know here we get back to that same old question of authorship. And I've heard him say before, well, we don't know who wrote it, but we know somebody wrote it. So that, I think that's true of James, just as it is with some of these other books. James is a person that has not, in my opinion, received his due in biblical scholarship. He's a person of more importance than has been realized, or he has not had the prominence that I think is justified. He is a figure in history that quite a bit is known about. He's not someone that we say, well, was there really a James, or really a brother of Jesus, and so forth. Josephus, the Jewish historian, writes extensively about James and talks about what he did. He talks about his death, talks about how he died, and so forth. And he's mentioned by Paul. Paul, in some of his letters, talks about James, the brother of Jesus. He's in Galatians, he does, and he mentions James as one of the pillars of the church. He's just more an important person. He was not apparently not converted to being a follower of Jesus at all during Jesus' lifetime. He was a devout Jew. The stories about James that I've told you before is he was extremely poor and pious, and he only had the clothes, they say, the clothes on his back, and he was called James the Just, and he was the high counselor. He was the person that people would come to for important counseling and decision making. And so he rose to this position of prominence after the death of Jesus, and then his contentiousness with Paul back and forth is very real. It's downplayed in the book of Acts because Luke is harmonizing everything in Acts. He's making it look like everybody got along together very well, but they didn't. James did not want. He kept a sort of a tight rein on Paul in terms of how far he allowed him to go, and he would call him in periodically for sort of a sit-down conference, and they would talk about the latitude that Paul had to convert Gentiles to Christianity and how he should go about it in regard to Jewish law. And we talked about one case. James suggested to Paul that he should show his allegiance to the law by actually going into the temple and making some sacrifices. And Paul agreed to do that. And it never took place because Paul got arrested before it ever happened. But James is a book that it becomes contemporary with the world as we see it today, because he is advocating more, he is steering his audience more towards goodness and kindness and being a good person here on earth than he is steering them toward concern and worrying about getting ready for some hereafter, and just saying that our time here on earth is just is just something we got to put up with and try to make the best we can. But really, our reward is later on. And James is saying that's not right. That we have an obligation to be a good person here on earth and to do good. We have an obligation to the poor, and we have an obligation to be kind and gentle and to people and so forth. And James has had through the years and through the hundreds of years, he's had a lot of flack for that, because Martin Luther, the great Reformation character, he said that James shouldn't even be in the New Testament. He said he called it a book of straw. He said that because it got the name of being what is referred to as works righteousness. Works righteousness. We all hear that today, and it's used in the context, you can't get to heaven by good works. In other words, if you think that giving money to the church and putting some money in the Salvation Army bucket and things like that is going to get you into heaven, you are wrong. Well, that's the way you can take James's message and sort of make it look like, well, I guess that's right, and so James has gotten some bad press for the last few hundred years, for sure, because that's not what he's saying at all. He's just saying that what is it to have faith? Just to say you have faith in something, if it doesn't make any difference in how you act, if it doesn't change your life in any way or anything, it doesn't make you more accessible to somebody that needs your help or helping the poor people or something like that. What good is it? So that's the other way of putting James in a way that it makes it more acceptable. And the book of James looks like, from reading it, that it's an older book, maybe going back as early as James' lifetime, because the quotes and the sayings in James are derived from the very first books of the Bible. And you remember we've talked a little bit about the Q gospel. The Q gospel is the lost gospel that Matthew and Luke got so much of their material from, because it's duplicated in both Matthew and Luke. And so there's a gospel out there somewhere that's never been found that has old sayings of Jesus that showed up in both those other books. Well, a lot of that shows up in James. And a lot of James is the teachings of Jesus, and coming from Luke, Matthew, and the Q gospel. Let me just see what I wrote down here. This would be the 50s. The CE saw the growth of turmoil in and around Jerusalem and Roman Judea as Jews experienced more and more corruption, injustice, and poverty. It continued up until the time that James was killed. War broke out and led to destruction of Jerusalem. And so this gospel is renowned, this book of James, Epistle of James, for exhorting the Jewish community to care for each other and care for those less fortunate, and to stand up for the oppressed, peacemaking and pursuing righteousness, and to stay focused on doing good and embrace the wisdom of heaven, not the wisdom of the world. So James is very straightforward about all this, and so much so that as I say, it has turned some people off who are who believe that works are not that important. But James in chapter 2, I'll just read a little bit. It said, if a man with gold rings and in fine clothing comes into your assembly, and a poor man in shabby clothing also comes in, and you pay attention to the one who wears the fine clothing and say, have a seat over here, please, while you say to the poor man, stand over there or sit at my feet, have you not made distinctions among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? Listen, my beloved brethren, has not God chosen those who are poor in the world to be rich in faith and heirs of the kingdom which he has promised to those who love him? But you have dishonored the poor man. It is not the rich who oppress you. It is not they who drag you into court. It is not they who blaspheme that horrible name which was invoked over you. So that's the kind of writing that James has. He's going back to the basic gospel of Jesus, and as depicted in the book of Mark, where the poor and the oppressed person is the person that we should be looking after and so forth. And I think it's becoming more appropriate now that we have issues in the world of climate change and poverty. The disparity between those that have and those that don't have is the widest that it's ever been in the history. So I think that I'm hopeful, at least, that the gospel, that the Epistle of James will come for more recognition. Well, that's about all the notes that I have. I did want to I'll make one more comment about how far did James, it's important, a question might arise. Okay, so James was a follower of Jesus at the end, and if not at first. So, but he was also an adherent to the law, So how did he feel about the law once he became a Christian Jew? And so I've made a note here. The law is important to James. It is a standard for human behavior. He kept thinking that the Jewish law continued to be a standard for human behavior, but it is not kept as a means of earning one's way into heaven. It is the standard of faith that best exemplifies faith and makes it complete. In other words, he's saying works is not a way to get into heaven, but it is the best example of a person that has faith. What would it be an example of that a person that has faith would show more than the fact that they cared about other people and that they were kind and generous and humble people. So he says those who possess faith are to treat and act toward each other in the manner that Jesus taught. So that's all I have, folks. That's a quick look at those 4 books, but James is a good book, and I think it's contemporary. I think now, we're to the point now in the world that we can't just sit here and wait for the hereafter, because we're going to be in water up to our eyes down here in Florida before long, and a lot of other things too. So it's got to be that we have some responsibility here on earth as well, toward the animal and plant life and trees and rivers and creeks and everything, and so I think James sort of points us in that direction, and so for that reason I think it's a book that I hope will come into more prominence for study. Yes, Caroline.
Is there a point that James talks about his conversion to become a Christian, to follow Christ? What happened to have that happen?
There is not. There is not. All of that is only supposition as to how that happened and how it came about. Because there is a verse that I think it's actually in my note, but there is verses that indicate that during Christ's lifetime he was not a follower of Christ, because there is a verse, I'll paraphrase just a tiny bit, but not much. It says his own brothers did not believe him. actually indicate he had other brothers also, but he says his own brothers did not believe him. So that is used to illustrate that none of his family, you remember, we talked about this in an earlier group, that there was at one point that Jesus' family showed up and was ready to have him committed. You know, they were saying, you know, what's come over him, you know. So he was not following, and that was at the same time when Jesus shows back up near Galilee in Capernaum, and he said, you know, said,
Prophets never honor his own
yeah, I
country.
mean, what is none?
No honor for a prophet in his own country.
Yeah, he said,
That's the idea.
yeah, the idea is don't, if you want to be accepted, don't go back to your hometown. Is what he was really saying. So, yeah, so James became an important figure. He was killed by the Romans. The story is that he was lured into the temple and up to a higher parapet of the temple and pushed off into the rocks below. And so that's the way he died. So it was, you know, one of the things, the overriding things that you fail to, as we study the times of the New Testament, is just how brutal things were in those days. Just how death was so cheap and people were brutal to each other. It was nothing to grab up people and take them out and crucify them. You know, probably every day there were crucifixions in and around Jerusalem, and the Romans were horrible in terms of this. You know, so and in the Jewish war in the 70 CEs and all that, we quoted that Josephus said that he thought there was up to 1 million people maybe were killed in that war. So, well, I really appreciate you all hanging in here for these few weeks, and it's been great for me. I know that, and it's great to see everyone. Y'all are just, every one of you is so dear to me.
Well, it's been
Thank
great.
you. Yeah, thank you for all your hard work, and it's great to
Well,
hear from you.
you're so welcome. So Caroline and I talked about it, maybe in the fall, when everybody gets through all their running around for the summer and having a good time, we'll pick out some other subject and do it again.
That would be wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is such a delight. I always hate it when I miss it, and I love it when I'm here. So I'll do it in the fall. I'm signing up.
All right. Well,
That'd be
thank you
great.
all again.
Absolutely.
Thanks,
Thank-
Polly.
Thank you so much.
All right.
Have a good summer.
Okay.
Yeah.
Y'all
Thank
too.
you.